Okay, so you want to buy an RV park. Find a stretch of land near a highway exit, pour some concrete pads, run in electricity and water, and watch people pay you every single night to park a vehicle they already own. It sounds like the cleanest business model in America. No inventory, no employees standing around all day. Just dirt, hookups, and a steady stream of travelers. Here's the problem. That mental picture is almost completely wrong, and the gap between what this business looks like from a highway billboard and what it actually is on a balance sheet is enormous. An RV park is not a real estate investment. It is a hospitality business wearing a real estate costume. Every night a campsite sits empty is not a delayed sale. It's a sale that vanished forever. A hotel understands this instinctively. Most first-time RV park buyers don't, and that single misunderstanding is why so many of them lose money in their first 3 years of ownership. So let's actually walk through the numbers, because the real economics of this business are far stranger, far more seasonal, and far more fragile than the YouTube thumbnails suggest. Start with what beginners get wrong first. Most people shopping for an RV park compare properties by acreage. How many acres, how many trees, how much river frontage? Professionals in this industry almost never think that way. They think in terms of traffic. A gorgeous 40-acre property tucked down a back road with no highway access can lose money for a decade. Meanwhile, a plain, unglamorous property with 200 sites sitting a few minutes from a national park entrance or an interstate off-ramp can print cash for its owner year after year. The land itself, the trees, the soil quality, the views, is nearly irrelevant on its own. What matters is the number of vehicles passing within a short drive of your gate. This is why experienced buyers will pay a stunning premium for a mediocre park in a great location over a beautiful park in a forgotten one. You're not really purchasing dirt. You're purchasing proximity to demand, and demand is the only ingredient that can't be built later. Now here's a question that trips up almost everyone who hasn't run the numbers. If location matters this much, and demand for camping keeps climbing, why doesn't someone just build 100 new parks near every popular exit and flood the market? Because building one is brutally difficult. Getting a new RV park approved is one of the more political processes in American land use. Local zoning boards frequently reject applications outright. Neighboring homeowners show up to town meetings to fight it. Running municipal water, sewer, and heavy-duty electrical service out to a rural parcel can cost hundreds of thousands of dollars before a single guest ever checks in. Environmental review alone can stretch the timeline past 2 full years, and that's before construction on roads, hookups, and buildings even begins. A developer chasing a fast return on capital will almost always find an easier, faster-moving project elsewhere, which is exactly why so little new supply enters this market even during periods of soaring demand. The result is a country where recreational vehicle ownership has grown enormously over the past 2 decades, while the supply of privately owned parks and campgrounds has barely kept pace. Industry counts put the number of privately owned RV parks and campgrounds in the United States at somewhere around 13,000 to 15,000 properties, and that number is only inching upward by roughly 1 to 2% a year. Scarcity like that is a gift to existing owners. It's also exactly why acquisition prices for well-located parks have climbed so aggressively over the last several years. If you're finding this breakdown useful, this would be a great moment to hit subscribe, like the video, and share it with someone who's actually looked into buying one of these properties. There's a demographic shift worth understanding here too, because it explains why demand for these scarce sites keeps climbing instead of leveling off. The average age of a first-time RV buyer has been dropping for years, and younger buyers now make up the single largest slice of new RV purchases, ahead of both Generation X and baby boomers combined. Remote work made it possible for a growing number of people to live and work from a laptop parked at a campsite instead of an office. That shift didn't just add a few extra guests to the industry. It added an entirely new category of customer, one who might stay for weeks or months at a time instead of a single weekend, occupying a site during what used to be the slow shoulder season. Owners who noticed this trend early restructured their pricing and their site mix to capture it, adding stronger internet infrastructure and longer stay discount tiers, while owners who ignored it kept marketing exclusively to weekend campers and left real money on the table. Now let's get into what it costs to actually get in the door, because the entry price is where most people's naive math starts falling apart. Development and acquisition costs in this business are usually measured on a per-site basis, and the range is wide. A bare-bones rural campground with gravel pads and basic hookups can run somewhere around $15,000 per site to build out. A polished destination resort with a pool, a clubhouse, paved roads, and premium pull-through sites can exceed $50,000 per site. Multiply that by 100 sites, and you're looking at anywhere from $1.5 million on the cheap end to $5 million or more for something upscale. And that's before a single guest has ever paid you a dime. Buying an existing, already operating park changes the math slightly, but not as much as people hope. Cap rates on RV park sales nationally tend to average somewhere close to 9 or 10%, with a typical range of about 8 to 12% depending on location, quality, and how stabilized the income already is. A lower cap rate generally signals a premium coastal property with steady, predictable occupancy. A higher cap rate usually signals more risk, more seasonality, and more work required to fix the operation after closing. Here's the part almost nobody warns first-time buyers about. The purchase price is just the entry fee. Layered underneath it are permitting costs, wastewater and septic engineering studies, fire department approvals, ADA compliance upgrades, and in many states, an entirely separate licensing process just to legally operate as a campground. None of that shows up in the glossy listing photos. All of it shows up in the first year's expense sheet. Once you actually own the property, the real test begins, and it's not the purchase price. It's occupancy. An RV park does not need every site full every night to be profitable. In fact, most healthy, well-run parks operate at an average annual occupancy of somewhere around 60 to 70%, and that's considered a strong, sustainable number for the industry. During peak summer weekends in a popular destination, that same park might sit at nearly full capacity. During a rainy Tuesday in February, it might be sitting closer to 20 or 30%. Let's run the math the way an owner actually has to run it. Say you own 120 sites with an average nightly rate of around $70. If you multiply that rate by every site every night of the year, you get an eye-popping theoretical revenue figure. Nobody ever actually collects that number. Once you apply a realistic blended occupancy of around 65% across the full calendar, factoring in slow winter months, shoulder seasons, and the occasional stretch of bad weather that keeps travelers off the road, your real annual revenue per site typically lands somewhere between $10,000 and $15,000. For the whole property, that might land you somewhere in the range of $1.25 million to $1.5 million a year in gross site revenue before a single operating expense is subtracted. That number sounds fantastic in isolation. But notice what already happened in that calculation. We didn't use the full theoretical revenue figure. We quietly cut it down by roughly a third the moment we applied a realistic occupancy assumption. That single adjustment, seemingly small on paper, is the difference between a park that looks like a gold mine in a listing brochure and one that actually behaves like a gold mine once you own it. Buyers who skip this step and simply multiply the nightly rate by every site and every day of the year are the same buyers who end up shocked, 6 months in, that their bank account doesn't match their spreadsheet. Now here's where the trap door opens. Fixed costs in this business don't care whether your sites are full or empty. Payroll for front desk staff, groundskeepers, and maintenance workers keeps running whether you have 10 guests or 110. Property insurance premiums, especially in areas exposed to flooding, wildfire, or hurricanes, keep accruing every single month. Property taxes keep accruing. Loan payments on whatever debt you used to buy or build the park keep accruing. Every empty site is not a cost you avoid. It's a cost you're still paying for, minus the revenue that would have offset it. And there's one operating cost that catches almost every new owner completely off guard, and that's electricity. Apartment buildings don't deal with this problem the way RV parks do. A modern motorhome can draw enormous amounts of power running air conditioning units, charging house batteries, and running appliances simultaneously. Older parks built decades ago were wired for a totally different era of camping. Back in a small trailer with a single air conditioner was considered heavy duty. Bringing an older park's electrical infrastructure up to modern 50-amp standards across an entire property can easily run into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. Buyers who skip a proper electrical inspection before closing sometimes discover this the hard way, usually during the first heat wave after they take ownership, when half the park trips a breaker at the exact same time. Think about what that actually means operationally. It's not a one-time embarrassment you fix and forget. A breaker failure during a holiday weekend, when every site is full and every guest expects functioning air conditioning, is the kind of event that generates a wave of one-star reviews within hours. Those reviews then follow the property for years, quietly suppressing bookings long after the electrical panel has been repaired. A physical failure and a reputational failure happen at the same moment, and only one of them, unfortunately, shows up on an insurance claim. Maintenance never really stops either. Roads crack under vehicle weight and need resurfacing. Septic and sewer lines clog and need to be jetted or replaced. Water systems develop leaks that can waste thousands of gallons before anyone notices. Bathhouses need constant cleaning and eventually full renovation. Unlike a plot of vacant land sitting quietly and appreciating, Every acre of an active RV park is constantly consuming labor and capital just to stay functional. Owners who don't budget for this in advance tend to discover it the expensive way, usually right when cash flow is already tight. So where does the real profit actually come from, if campsite fees alone barely cover the fixed costs? This is the part that surprises most outsiders the most. In a lot of successful parks, the campsite rental itself is closer to a break-even foot traffic generator than the primary profit engine. The real margin often comes from everything sold around the campsite. Camp stores selling ice, firewood, and snacks, coin laundry, propane refills, golf cart and kayak rentals, premium waterfront or pull-through sites that command a significant markup over standard back-end spots, cabin rentals and glamping units that can charge several times what a bare RV site earns per night. With dramatically lower wear and tear on the property, a campsite fee gets a guest through the gate. Everything they spend after that is where an owner actually builds wealth. Think about a family that pulls in for a 4-night stay over a long weekend. The site fee itself might land somewhere around $300 total for the stay. That same family will often buy firewood on the first night, ice every morning, a round of ice cream from the camp store for the kids, a couple of loads of laundry before they head home, and maybe an afternoon golf cart rental to explore the property. By the time they check out, their total spending at the park can easily run 40 or 50% higher than the site fee alone. Multiply that pattern across 100 sites, running at a healthy occupancy for an entire season, and ancillary spending stops being a rounding error. It becomes one of the largest single line items on the park's income statement, and unlike the site fee itself, most of it carries a considerably fatter margin because the underlying cost of a bag of ice or a bundle of firewood is a fraction of what it sells for at the camp store register. Premium sites work the same way from a different angle. A standard back-in gravel pad might rent for the base nightly rate, while a pull-through site with a water view, extra concrete pad space, and a fire ring can command a markup of 20 to 30% over that same base rate, for essentially the same underlying cost to the owner. Smart operators learn to grade their sites the way a hotel grades its rooms, charging noticeably more for the ones guests actually fight over booking first. There's also a quieter strategic decision every owner eventually has to make, and it's the balance between short-term guests and long-term monthly renters. Monthly tenants are wonderful for stability. They reduce vacancy, cut down on cleaning and turnover costs, and create predictable cash flow every 30 days without much marketing effort. But lean too heavily into monthly renters, and a vacation-oriented RV resort can slowly drift into feeling like a permanent trailer community. That shift changes the kind of guest willing to book a weekend stay, it changes pricing power, and over time it can even reduce what the property itself is worth to a future buyer. Getting that balance right is one of the harder judgment calls in this entire business. Pricing itself has also changed dramatically over the last several years. Hotels have used dynamic, demand-based pricing for decades, and RV parks have finally caught up. Software now lets owners raise rates automatically around holiday weekends, drop them during slow shoulder periods, and adjust in real time based on how quickly sites are booking. A campsite is no longer sold at one flat number all year. It's sold more like an airline seat, priced according to exactly how badly people want it on that specific date. None of that pricing sophistication matters, though, if nobody can find your park in the first place. Marketing in this business used to mean a road sign and a listing in a paper directory. Today it means online reviews, booking app visibility, and professional photography. A cluster of one-star reviews about dirty bathrooms can quietly suppress bookings for months. A few well-shot photos and a strong review score can fill a property almost on autopilot. Marketing isn't decoration anymore in this industry. It functions as occupancy insurance. Booking behavior itself has shifted just as dramatically as the marketing channels feeding it. A large share of travelers now research and reserve a campsite entirely through their phone, comparing listings, photos, and reviews across several apps before they ever pick up a telephone or drive past the front gate. A property that isn't accurately listed on the major booking platforms, with current photos and real-time availability, is effectively invisible to a huge slice of its potential customer base, no matter how nice the actual campground looks in person. Owners who treat their online listing with the same seriousness a hotel treats its website tend to run meaningfully higher occupancy than owners who still rely on a hand-painted road sign and word of mouth. Wi-Fi deserves a special mention here because it has quietly become one of the most decisive amenities in the entire industry. A large majority of guests now rate reliable internet access as a highly important factor in choosing where to camp, right alongside clean bathrooms and a safe, quiet setting. That single amenity, which costs relatively little to install and maintain compared to a pool or a clubhouse, can be the deciding factor between a guest booking your property or scrolling past it toward a competitor down the road. All of this operational complexity hasn't scared off big money. It's actually attracted it. For most of the last century, RV parks were overwhelmingly family-run businesses, passed down or sold quietly between local owners. That has shifted noticeably. Publicly traded real estate investment trusts have moved aggressively into this space. Sun Communities, listed on the New York Stock Exchange, has grown into one of the largest owners of manufactured housing and RV resort properties in the country, with a portfolio that now spans several hundred communities and well over 150,000 developed sites across the United States, Canada, and the United Kingdom. Its main publicly traded rival, Equity Lifestyle Properties, has built a similar strategy around the same asset class. Watch how these larger players actually behave, and you start to see the underlying logic of the entire industry. They aren't chasing single standalone campgrounds. They're assembling large regional clusters of properties, so a guest who enjoys one resort in one state can be funneled through a shared loyalty program and a shared booking platform toward a sister property a few states away during their next trip. That kind of cross-property loyalty is nearly impossible for a single independent owner to replicate, and it's part of why institutional buyers are often willing to pay a lower cap rate, meaning a higher price relative to income, for a well-run park than a private buyer would. Why would institutional money with countless options chase a business this operationally messy? Because from a boardroom, an RV park doesn't look like a campground. It looks like recession-resistant infrastructure. Occupancy holds up reasonably well even when the broader economy wobbles, because staying somewhere in an RV is dramatically cheaper than a hotel. Supply is constrained by the same zoning fights that block small operators. And because monthly and seasonal renters lock in recurring income, cash flow tends to be steadier than a typical hotel's. Steady does not mean risk-free, and this is the part every optimistic buyer needs to sit with before writing a check. Insurance costs in wildfire and hurricane-exposed regions have climbed sharply in recent years, and in some coastal and forested markets, carriers have simply stopped writing new policies altogether, forcing owners into far more expensive surplus lines coverage. A single bad wildfire season can force an evacuation that empties a property during its highest-earning weeks of the year. A single hurricane can flood a riverside park and destroy electrical pedestals, septic systems, and roads in one weekend, with repair bills stretching into the hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars depending on the scale of the damage. Recessions hit tourism-dependent revenue harder than owners expect because a road trip is one of the easiest expenses for a stressed household to cancel. Fuel price spikes can quietly suppress long-distance travel for months at a time. None of these risks show up anywhere in a rosy pro forma spreadsheet, and every one of them has ended a first-time owner's ambitions before their 5th year of operation. Here's the structural point buried inside all of these disaster scenarios, and it's worth sitting with for a moment. In almost every other kind of small business, a slow month is a slow month. You sell a little less, you tighten spending a little, and you move on. In this business, the fixed costs stay locked in place no matter what the weather, the economy, or the calendar throws at you, while the revenue side is the one variable exposed to nearly every outside shock imaginable. That asymmetry between rigid costs and volatile revenue is exactly what makes RV parks capable of producing both remarkably strong returns in a good year and genuinely painful losses in a bad one. It isn't a flaw in how any individual owner runs their property. It's baked into the structure of the business itself. Labor is worth a mention here too, because it's easy to underestimate before you actually own a property. Front desk staff, groundskeepers, and maintenance workers typically account for somewhere around a quarter to nearly a third of total operating expenses at a well-staffed park. Finding reliable seasonal workers in a rural tourist area, particularly during the exact same summer weeks when every other local business is also hiring for its peak season, is harder than it sounds from the outside. A park that can't adequately staff its front desk or its groundskeeping crew during a sold-out holiday weekend doesn't just lose a little efficiency. It loses the reviews, and therefore the future bookings, that come from guests who showed up expecting a smoothly run resort and instead found an overwhelmed skeleton crew. So let's put the whole picture together with 2 honest scenarios, because that's the only fair way to evaluate whether this business actually works for a specific buyer. In the optimistic scenario, you've bought a well-located 100-site park for around $3 million. You run a blended annual occupancy near 70% at an average nightly rate of around $75, supplemented by a healthy camp store, cabin rentals, and monthly winter guests filling your slower months. After payroll, insurance, taxes, utilities, and routine maintenance, you're clearing a net operating income somewhere in the range of $350,000 to $400,000 a year. Against your purchase price, that's a healthy, sustainable return, and if you finance part of the deal, you're still comfortably covering debt service with room to spare. In the realistic scenario, your first year opens with a wildfire evacuation that cost you your entire peak July weekend, your insurance premium jumps by nearly 40% at renewal because your county got reclassified as higher risk, and an older section of your electrical grid fails during a heat wave, forcing an emergency upgrade you hadn't budgeted for. Your occupancy for the year lands closer to 50% instead of 70%. Your net operating income for that year might fall to somewhere around $100,000, barely enough to cover debt service, let alone reinvest in the property. The difference between a strong year and a genuinely bad year in this business can easily be $200,000 to $300,000 in net income on a single 100-site property. That gap is the entire risk profile of this industry compressed into one sentence. Notice what didn't change between those two scenarios. The purchase price stayed exactly the same. The debt payment stayed exactly the same. The property taxes stayed exactly the same. What moved was occupancy, insurance, and one unplanned repair, and that alone was enough to swing the property from a healthy, comfortable return down to something that barely covers its own debt service. This is precisely why experienced buyers in this industry stress test their occupancy assumptions far more aggressively than a first-time buyer typically does, and why they tend to keep a meaningful cash reserve set aside specifically for the year that doesn't go according to plan, rather than assuming every year will look like the optimistic one. It's also why financing terms matter enormously in this business, arguably more than in most other small commercial real estate purchases. A buyer who stretches to the maximum loan amount a lender will offer, based on an optimistic occupancy projection, is the same buyer who ends up in serious trouble the moment a realistic bad year actually shows up. A more conservative buyer, one who underwrites the deal using the realistic scenario rather than the optimistic one, walks into ownership with a much thicker cushion and a much better chance of still owning the property comfortably 5 years later. Before we close this out, if you want a broader, practical breakdown of how businesses like this actually get evaluated, financed, and operated day to day, there's a detailed business guide covering exactly that linked in the description below and pinned in the first comment. It's worth a look if you're seriously considering a purchase like this one. What all of this really tells you is that an RV park was never truly a real estate play. The land is just the stage. The actual business is convincing the same traveler to come back year after year and spend a little more each time they do. Owners who treat this like a hospitality company, not a landlord operation, are consistently the ones who come out ahead. The ones who treat it purely as a piece of land, collecting a rent check and hoping the property appreciates on its own, tend to be the ones selling 5 years later, usually for a lot less than they expected, and usually a good deal wiser about what this business actually was all along. If you found this breakdown valuable, do like the video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Thanks so much for watching.